So obviously, critical thinking is at the heart of a lot of philosophy and logic. Um, as we've been reading so far, just the few things that we've read so far this semester, there's been a contrast between the unexamined life and the examined life. Um, we've read things about Socratic questioning. So obviously, philosophical thinking, takes its point of departure maybe from common sense in many cases, but it critically examines common sense. Um, it's a critical reflection on truthiness and these sorts of things, and it has a concern for the truth and for good reasoning and only believing on the basis of good reasoning versus bad reasoning. And of course, trying to figure out what to believe or thinking about thinking is central to doing philosophy and certainly trying to do philosophy well. So, what do we mean when we say critical thinking, really? Um, you might hear that term critical and just think of nagging, which is easy to get, easy to see that sometimes, right? But when we when we talk about critical thinking in the context of philosophy and in maybe communication studies and in English classes and these sorts of things, where we have a concern over persuasiveness, but not just being flattering or engaged in sophistry, but trying to produce good, reasonable arguments. When we're engaged in that activity, we're worried about critical thinking. And I don't just mean, say, being negative or naysaying some of the other side, just being negative or critical against something for the sake of being against it, without regard for why we're against it. Forming beliefs, figuring out what we're in favor of or what we think is true, what we think is false, requires us to critically scrutinize things. And that theme has been running throughout many of our readings so far this semester. So when we talk about critical thinking, we have something more like this in mind, which comes from the definition I'm going to use here, comes from the Delphi report, which was a big report by some academics and specialists in various disciplines that were interested in critical thinking. And they defined critical thinking as the purposeful self-regulatory judgment which results in interpretation, analysis, evaluations, and inference, as well as explanation of evidential, conceptual, methodological, criteriological, and contextual consideration upon which judgment is based. So that's a mouthful, right? But it's simply, put more simply, it's the task of thinking about thinking and questioning very precisely what we mean and what reasons there are for thinking that that is true versus it being false, what evidence is relevant, and forming an opinion on the basis of a gathering of the relevant empirical information and making logical inferences based on the information that's available to us, and avoiding errors of fact, fallacy, and self-contradiction, right? Constructing cogent or valid and sound arguments. That's what we're interested in. And so that involves critical thinking, of course. And so a famous quote by W.K. Clifford, which maybe overstates things a little bit, but nevertheless certainly has a kernel of truth to it. In his essay, The Ethics of Belief, he says that every time we let ourselves believe for unworthy reasons, we weaken our powers of self-control, of doubting, of judiciously and fairly weighing the evidence. He concluded it is therefore always wrong everywhere and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient reason. So it's a pretty bold statement and a fairly strong statement, but you get the basic idea, right? That if we don't exercise care with regard to what we believe, we weaken our abilities to regulate our own lives and to make decisions for ourselves that are in our own interest and concern our well-being, both personal and socially, right? So we don't want to be duped, right? I don't want to be duped. I don't want to believe false things. I certainly don't want to be engaged in any kind of self-deception. I want to try to work hard to avoid either being deceived by others because they're just repeating mistaken information or because they're maliciously trying to propagandize me or market to me in an unfair way or a duplicitous way. I don't want to be taken over by messaging that's flowery but not truthful and doesn't have concern for good evidence and reasoning, especially when we're trying to figure out the big questions in life or the big questions of philosophy. We got to try to exercise to the best of our ability our capacities to cultivate our reason and to think critically and do that well. So, of course, we've talked about Socratic questioning and how Socrates emphasized that questioning was very important. It was the pathway to seeking, figuring out what was true or not. We've looked at the Socratic method a couple of times and had a few references to it, both in one of the very first articles that we were probably assigned this semester from Young. He says what was important about Socrates' own defense, though, isn't so much what he says, as how he says it. He defends himself by questioning his accuser, Meletus, and leading him through a process of reasoning to try to debunk his own reasoning that he was offering against Socrates. So, again, we talked about the Socratic method as a form of critical thinking and a method of doing philosophy. So that often begins with the Socratic question, what is blank, where we ask a conceptual question, and then the interlocutor and Socrates engage in a dialogue back and forth where they're refining the concept of what they're talking about and being more precise about it, and then offering more careful reasons for and against it until reaching a point of aporia, which they admit that they don't know as what they originally claimed to know, or at least not as much about it as they thought they did, upon Socratic questioning, and then Socrates tries to offer his own solution, right, in his monologue. And we talked about how, examples of this in pop culture, examples of Socratic friendship, like between Kyle and Stan in South Park, or how another article I often use around this time in the semester is about Rick and Morty as Socratic television, because throughout many of the episodes, the characters are arguing back and forth about some value in a very way similar to the Socratic dialogues. And of course, being willing to engage in critical thinking requires, exercising, having certain levels of, at least, in being open enough to question things. Of course, we've talked about dogmatism a little bit, and it'll come up again later in the semester when we cover intellectual vices and talk about echo chambers, maybe. But Aristotle famously remarked that virtue is partly intellectual. It has to do with what we're learning, right? And we need to be open-minded enough to consider the possibility that we're wrong and to gather evidence and to be critical thinkers and form our beliefs on the basis of a careful analysis of things. And in doing that, that's going to require that we exercise certain attitudes towards things, not be closed-minded, or at least not so closed-minded that we're unwilling to reflect critically about our own beliefs, especially when we're asking other people to believe them, maybe. And again, I don't want to be duped myself. I don't want to be closed-minded. If I'm closed-minded, I may get something wrong. I don't want to get it wrong, right? So this is going to involve what some people have called a version, at least, of some kind of a classical conceptual analysis. So, in an article called by this very name, Earl says that philosophy involves the exercises of one's rational capacity in seeking correct answers to the most fundamental questions there are. The capacity includes at least two components. One is the ability to grasp various logical relationships that may exist between premises and conclusions, and the other is the ability to engage in analysis. But what is analysis? And he says there are two senses. That is an activity, and that is the product of an activity. In classical analysis, he starts to connect it up with Socrates with that Socratic question: what is blank? What is justice? What is knowledge? What is reality? What is the good? What is right conduct? And in classical analysis, tries to produce an answer by specifying the necessary and sufficient conditions of what justice is and what fairness is, moving way beyond the dictionary common usage definitions of those terms. Right? So, again, another reading that we've encountered this semester was from Johnson, and of course, he had several elements of doing philosophy Colbert style that we covered. And that included the principle of charity, interpreting things in the most charitable way to make so that they're the best case, um, not judge things unfairly, avoid self-contradiction, gut thinking, and so forth. He drew a distinction between intuition and gut thinking. Again, gut thinking is kind of the opposite of critical thinking. He emphasized the idea that we have epistemic right to what's rationally justifiable, what can be supported by reasonable arguments. There's a concern for truth involved, supporting one's own views with evidence and bearing the burden of proof, abandoning unsupported belief and remaining agnostic when there's not enough evidence to really draw even a tentative conclusion. So, some methodological principles for critical thinking we can get from this: exercising the principle of charity, um, intellectual honesty, and avoiding special pleading or double standard fallacies. We should expect and shouldn't expect others to have a higher burden of proof for the positions we don't have and a lower burden of proof for our preferred views. That would, of course, be a double standard there. And we have to accept the burden of proof. So when we argue for a claim, we got to be willing to support that claim and come up with some uh, plausibly good uh, reasons in favor of it and evidence if it's relevant. And so adopted this outsider test argument from another context to be more broad for us as an example of a critical thinking argument. And of course, we're all raised to believe various things because of the time and places that we're raised that influence what views are available to us and what views we could come up with out of those. And so, obviously, our time and place in history uh, are going to influence some of the things we believe, right? And so, it's very possible that many of the beliefs that we have may not be true, right? Because of the diversity of beliefs, just the sheer number of different beliefs about those topics that there are. And so we can think of this as an outsider test argument, how to think critically about our beliefs. So just adapting it for just basically any really significant belief. So he says the first part of the argument in premise one there, line one is rational, well-intentioned, inquisitive people across the world through history adopt a wide range of beliefs due, at least in part, to their different upbringings and cultural heritages. Many of our current beliefs are likely to be dependent upon upbringing and culture, rather than conclusions of critical thought and logical reasoning, research, and so forth. And what he's getting at is no systematic study. Um, it would be an extraordinary coincidence if each of us just happened to be raised to believe only true beliefs, given the number of conflicting different beliefs that there are that people are raised to believe. So it's more likely that any one of my beliefs was formed as a result of upbringing and heritage rather than rational inquiry. Thus, the best way to test any particular belief is by adopting the perspective of an outsider, applying the same skeptical attitude towards my preferred beliefs as I do towards beliefs that I do not hold. So it's trying to wrap in there this idea of thinking critically not only about what other people ask us to believe, but the beliefs that we find ourselves with already, to engage in a little self-reflective critical thinking there. Of course, we got to worry about things like cognitive biases when we're engaged in this sort of reasoning. So lots of empirical studies show that human beings suffer from all sorts of cognitive biases. Probably no shock to anybody. You've probably heard of things like confirmation bias or maybe motivated reasoning. We're often dismissive of evidence that doesn't fit our preferred views. We interpret new evidence in ways that confirms those pre-existing views. We overestimate bias that's more readily available to us, or we weight it heavier. There's all sorts of cognitive biases and cognitive hazards that we have to worry about. So you can very easily research some of those. I really recommend looking at things like the backfire effect, Dunning-Kruger effect, confirmation bias, and framing bias, and these sorts of things. These are all interesting cognitive biases that we're all prone to and that we all fall victim to on occasion. So, but the more you know, the better off you are armed against maybe committing them. Maybe a little bit less if we just learn a little bit more about them and how to recognize them in ourselves. And then, of course, we need, as I mentioned before, it requires a certain level of open-mindedness here. And so, obviously, kind of critical thinking is going to be blocked by intellectual or epistemic biases. Things like truthiness or gut thinking. Maybe we've covered Frankfurt's notion of BS. Both of those have to do with a lack of concern for the truth, right? So it's a kind of attitude that would get in the way of gaining new knowledge. So an epistemic or intellectual vice, a lack of intellectual curiosity, intellectual laziness, in other words, willful ignorance or wishful thinking, and then the most probably clear example of an intellectual vice, dogmatism or closed-minded, people that just refuse to even question what it is that they most ardently believe because, for whatever reason. Uh, Cover more about that sort of thing later on in the semester when we get to echo chambers and epistemic vices right here. Just want to introduce that basic idea of something, being in the way of critical thinking, a kind of obstacle to it. And so that'll do it for a little quick overview of what we mean by critical thinking when we're looking at stuff in philosophy and logic and communication in English classes where you're going to be studying fallacies, maybe studying different rhetorical techniques and things like this in an effort to avoid them and in an effort to learn how to produce well-reasoned and informed arguments that avoid some common errors in reasoning.